I'm really grateful to you for taking the time today in extending into our session, and of course, grateful to FIMA for the opportunity to talk about today's topic. We're focused today on overcoming what we're calling data friction and going towards a more collaborative platform for data analytics. And I know that this is a dialogue conversation over our relationship that we've talked about a lot, but I will ask, and not to put you on the spot, but how would you define this notion of data friction in the face of the fact that we have data friction everywhere, right? We've got data friction in every sub-industry. And if you looked at this chart, is all too familiar to you, Chuck, in the context of the GICS classification, all of the sub-industries associated with financial services, every one of them has, and we can point out probably examples of every one of them having data friction, but how would you define data friction?
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot, Steve. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
We always do. You know, there's been a lot of talk about data friction, and if you just look at, a definition of friction, it's, how difficult it is to go from one place to another. What's the friction? Sometimes it's rubbing against things, and sometimes it's, the friction between people. But in the data world, it's all about the journey of data. It's the journey of data from its source to the end user, the person that really needs to have the data. And I've always simplified that topic, Steve. I've always said data friction is the difficulty of getting the right data to the right people at the right time to help them make decisions. That's what it's all about. In the end, if you look at this, at all the sub-industries, and it affects every single one of them. When business users get data, they need data to help them make decisions. They need insights. And the difficulty of getting that data to them is really what data friction is all about. So I tried to simplify it.
Yeah, I think you have. I mean, what I think is beautiful about that is this notion that data's in constant movement, but it has this. It really has an inertia that keeps it in one place, or keeps it siloed, or keeps it not getting down to users. And the ease of which end business users can get to and ask questions is often really the biggest problem space. I would add, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, in in financial services, which is probably more data than any other industry. I mean, some people think retail has a lot of data. Financial services, and data friction leads to the customer experience friction, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
The experience that the customer has with the organization they're working with, whether it's a asset management organization, investment banking, whatever it is a simple regional bank, that customer experience friction is often caused by the data friction that organization has.
Yeah.
It's just like when someone makes a call to a call center because they have a problem, and if that call center doesn't have all the right data in front of them, the customer that's calling feels friction. They don't feel good about that interaction unless the person on the other end has all the information about who they are, what products they own, etc.
So there's no doubt that in the context of as you said, moving from one place to another, or that data journey through the organization, the only way you're really going to empower or overcome or move to an overcoming of that notion of improving the customer experience is to make sure that data journey is really available not only for the internal support team, but for all the lines of business. And that, I just in terms of this notion and the way you define data friction really brings me to my a picture I wanted to show you, and it's something that you've seen far too many times, I would think, which is what I like to define as the traditional data factory, right? And I really think that when you're talking about the way you articulated that notion of data friction and overcoming it, I think what we've got to do is make a faster move between the data source out to the end user. I mean, if you think about this, what I call the old way of doing things, it really is complex and resource intensive. And I would argue that, there's an unbundling here between business and IT and this traditional old way of doing things, where when we have a question, we have to go and get on a priority list with IT. We have an entirely separate unit that's building out the gathering the data together, building out the problem space, getting that data with lots of SQL or ETL, kind of prepping that out, and then getting to a point where we are answering that quote unquote business question. But what's really happening is because we have that decoupling between business and IT, and we don't have the platform for the collaboration, it's kind of like, here's our problem, go solve it. We go through this process and get to an output, and then we have a new question, or we have a new problem that's created by the answer to the original problem space, and then we've got to do this path and process all over again. So the traditional data factory seems to be, to me, a source of the problem and a creation of the data friction, because it's not only going from source to end user, but how do you simplify this, make it less resource intensive, while at the same time making it more collaborative. So the push that I see, at least, is to reduce that friction. And when you have a question, have that data available to you, both as in a business and IT collaborative position, and be able to ask those questions and iterate on those questions and get new insight. And I'm just curious how your thoughts there.
Well, it's, you make a really good point here. I mean, those of us that have been in the business as long as you and I have lived that old way forever. I mean, since we started. And it's not that it's a bad way. It just is a lot of steps and a lot of movement. And in the end, when you get to the far right of that, usually what you have is an aggregation of the data at some point.
That's right.
You don't have the detailed transactions that you usually really need for insight. And so, and there's no way around it, because, historically, we just haven't had the technology. There hasn't been the ability to give people all the data. There wasn't enough. Hell, there wasn't enough disk space, if you think about it. At one point,
that's absolutely right. Yeah.
And just the whole idea of moving the data through all those different steps took a lot of time, and you always had to aggregate the data to give people quick access to it. And it's something we've lived for a long time, and finally we're at a point now where we can eliminate almost all of those steps and get from the detailed transaction data that is needed for true insight in the hands of the right people.
Yeah, and what I really love about that too is that notion that we're always getting to an aggregation, right? In a lot of these cases, and we're really not going from that top line aggregation and didn't really have the ability to get down to the base level transaction, right? So the transaction detail and getting that baseline transaction gets us down. You talked about the customer experience prior, right? And the importance of that. When you really think about it, having the more detail you have on that customer, on that product, on the service that you're offering, the more information you can get at your fingertips, the more granular you can be in that process, the better that customer experience is, regardless of the financial services sub-industry that you're in, regardless of what product or service you're providing. I'm curious. I have certainly in my past experience an example of where, going beyond a traditional data factory and pulling together data from complex disparate source systems, I could get to a really powerful new way of viewing the world and insisting in aiding a line of business. I'm curious, could you give me an example in your past experience of a customer you've worked with and the problem space that they face and the solution to go down in a new way of doing things?
Yes, examples are always kind of bring things to life. I'm just thinking through. We at eCapital have worked with an organization, and this is not in the too distant past either. This is fairly recently, where this organization had partnered with a retailer to offer a store branded credit card. And that client base, those clients that had that credit card were, they were a higher risk client than the bank that we were working with would normally have in their credit cards. And their challenge was trying to reduce the retail partners' kind of credit card risk. That was a challenge. They really needed to reduce the risk. And they needed a way to identify credit card accounts that were likely to be fraudulent or charged off. Especially, in the whole COVID world, everything's changed, and all of a sudden, it was people were living a whole different life.
And a new set of analysis needed to be done.
Right, exactly. And so they wanted to, understand what accounts were more likely to charge off to fraud and non-payments. And they wanted to do it as early as possible in a credit card life. Let's do this as soon as we possibly can. And it required multiple data sources, Steve. There was at least 7 different data sources it required. Both bank that we were working with, data, the retailers' data, and outside data like credit scores, and combining all that data in the old traditional way of going from source data, doing your extraction and your summarization and your loads and transformations and moving it all the way through the process just took too long. It just was not going to work. And by the time they got to the end, it was too late. And so with the new platform, we were able to combine all those data sources into one platform, one place, and connect the dots, to make sure that we were talking about the same person when you have all those different data sources.
Exactly.
Sure, you're talking about the same credit card, owner. And in the end, it saved them over $900,000, almost $1 million in doing this. And to do it required machine learning. It required some form of data science. It required machine learning and the algorithms that are associated with that to really mine that data. And the only way we could do it is if we could solve the data problem of getting all the data together. And along with the data, Steve, what made the difference was the people. You had to have the right people in place that knew how to do the analysis, that knew how to do the data engineering to get the data together, and using the new platform, you needed people that understood machine learning and could communicate with the business. Because you know as well as I do that business users and data science, that they many times their eyes glassed over and they get fearful of it and go, I don't really understand how that all works. It's a big black box.
Yeah.
And having people that could communicate and be liaisons between the business and the technology people was a key element of making that work. And it was a great example of something real and an example of saving real money in today's world.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like when we're talking about overcoming this data friction. So we've really talked, at least initially, about that movement, right? And getting a faster speed to value on that movement of data between where it's sourced and where it comes from the end user. And now what I'm hearing from you, and I completely agree, is this combination of having the right data, having the platform that's positioned in place to get that data down, managed appropriately, and ready for the analysis. But then most importantly, having the right people connected to that platform and data, and having a process in place where their analysis and the work that they can do can be easily, shared among them, but also gives them access to iterate on that and have effectively, it seems like, a feedback loop with what's being generated and created out of that to make a really easy process on that. So it sounds to me like there really has to be a partnership between, in the traditional sense of the word, the IT and the technical layer and business user to be really successful.
Oh, absolutely. It was the only thing that made that successful was that partnership. And even to the point, at the end, one of the things that had to happen was once the outcome was produced out of the machine learning and they were able to identify the credit card users and owners that were either fraudulent or were going to charge off, how you presented that to someone made a difference to the business user. What did the visualization look like? What did the dashboard look like? Because that made a difference. Just giving them a whole bunch of spreadsheets and numbers wasn't enough. You had to really make it visually clear as to what you were showing them. So having someone being able to do that was important. And they didn't go out and hire a whole ton of people to do this. They had some people that they did some training for on the inside. They had some visualization experts that were already there. They had a leader that was really familiar with that kind of process, which made a huge difference. So the people part was critical. And like you say, the connection between IT and the business was what made it work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my own experience in investment banking, capital markets, I mean, I've seen some really strong coordinations between IT and the business, and was lucky enough to have those kind of experiences. I mean, I've seen a terrific example of this kind of work of reducing and overcoming data friction. Really, and in my case, it was moving well beyond just standard CRM and customer understanding. In the investment banking business, we really focused on trying to get a sense of not only what a customer's holdings were, what their fundamental investment style was, but also what were our interactions associated with them? What kind of research were they reading and looking at? How were they engaging in market with their buys and sells through their 13F filings? And where did we really sit within that profitability layer? And just gathering that data together in a meaningful way to start traversing that and answering questions within the investment banking space is incredibly difficult. But we had an enormous amount of success, going in and having the right platform, people, and process, if you will, which is I think a standard cliche, but also something that is not a cliche in the sense of data friction. I mean, you've really got to have the appropriate tools, the right data, and the right leadership and people in place to have something that's successful like that. And I was lucky enough in my own experience to really drive fundamental revenue and business value from that output. So in your case, reducing risk, being really clear about the risk position that you're in with that retailer, and having a very clear understanding of the forward prediction of what might happen. In my case, it's really about growing revenue and improving profitability by serving customers more effectively and garnering more insights across those disparate data sets that I mentioned, and to get to an answer, which really brings me to another point here, which is how do we think about these contributors to data friction? And I'll give this my just real brief overview. I mean, I really think that all of those sub-industries within financial services are really have these kind of three fundamental challenges that we're seeing here, and they're all interplayed in with one another. We don't have the success of overlaying the digital transformation to improve profitability and fix our risk and regulatory and compliance issues. It's really a balance between all of these forces right now, I think, in financial services. So from a revenue and profitability improvement perspective, I mean, look at the interest rate environment, the chase T yield, the situation there is really, and just fee pressure all around. To me, that's really a chase to revenue, and with that, an improvement on profitability. And I think every financial services organization is right now in a place where they've got to do more and make more revenue with less investment. Yeah. And, secondly, I think that from a regulatory risk and compliance perspective, the complexity of the regulatory environment isn't going to change. I think I've heard you say, we won't have another Dodd-Frank, but we're going to keep having this kind of complexity and necessity. And I think with that will come a real management of risk and a real focus on transparency within risk. So within the operations of the business and within the regulatory and compliance environment, we're really looking for transparency. And then on the digital transformation side, with all of those initiatives in the face of CCPA and GDPR and data initiatives, there's a real need to want to reduce the cost to serve the customer. And I think that comes really from having a strong data foundation So with all of those parts in play in the context of what we've been speaking about with data friction, I'd love to know your thoughts here on these issues or what you would add.
Well, first of all, Steve, you did a great job of explaining it. It was very well done. I think a lot about the customers that we work with and the data issues that they face, and so often in financial services, the sensitive information is so critical. And how do you provide insights, and how do you provide the right information to people without, making it so that the regulatory issues around personal information and putting yourself in trouble by putting it out there. It happens. It actually happens more often than people know that it does. And so there's this whole idea of, I want to improve my revenue and profitability. I want to have a better experience with my customer. I want a 360-degree view of my customer, but who sees that data about that customer? And how sensitive is it? And how does it relate to the compliance and regulatory issues that we're facing in a digital world?
Yeah.
Where everything is digital.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the other aspect of that, right? From a regulatory perspective, that PII and that position and that transactional history with GDPR and CCPA, that's certainly one of those balance points between what's happening in the risk and regulatory environment and what's happening in digital transformation. And how do you make that balance? I would argue also, though, in the context of that regulatory framework, there's a lot of data that needs to be utilized for the regulator to position and report to the regulator, to engage on AML, to engage on CECL, to engage on Basel III and Dodd-Frank, and so there's a lot of necessity. I think a lot of work that's being done at every financial services organization that's impacted by the strong regulatory environment, and that's all of them. I think every one of them is struggling with, how do I bring that data together to meet the need of the regulator? And with that, can I have a profitability improvement? Can I reduce my costs? Can I hopefully be, as I'm pushing into new areas of revenue, can I make sure that I'm complying with the regulatory environment and offering up that reporting and have an operational understanding? But what's really, I think, really interesting about what's happening now with regard to data friction and how organizations are starting to get out of it, and I've heard a number of people say this to me in varying ways, is we spent much of our time in a data-driven environment being having a regulatory focus, right, on data because of the needs of what we had to do for the regulator. And now what I'm hearing is that's not driving our data initiatives now. It's how do we be client-focused in our data position, gather together the data to have a more effective client position with regard to our business, and then ultimately make sure that we can subsume the needs of the regulatory compliance environment underneath that. And obviously, we need to do that because of the regulatory environment, because of the risk environment. And that really seems to be the driving factor in digital transformation to improve revenue, build new products, connect to new customers with new services and new products in meaningful ways that are both profitable and grow revenue. I mean, when I think about this engine, that's where I see the shift happening, at least what I'm hearing from customers. I'd love to know your thoughts there.
I hear the same thing. And, what you show up there, the whole circle there, is it creates data friction by definition.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
You're trying to serve a different master.
Yeah.
And so the data friction is just and to have a platform that can so that has the ability to reduce that friction by getting you to the transaction level of detail and serving both the customer and what you're looking to do when it comes to revenue and profitability improvement, as well as being able to serve the regulators And in this digital world is the only way that I think you can truly compete in the market right now. I think that is absolutely necessary. And finally, I believe we have a platform that lets you do that. I've been doing this for a long time, Steve, and I have yet to see anything other than the old data factory until now.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I'm incredibly excited about it because when I first saw it, I raised my hand and say, no, what you're telling me is not going to work.
Yeah. The challenge to get to that place, it's having that technical position, right? And what I'm really hearing is in overcoming data friction in this conversation with you, it really sounds like get the data movement, get the data journey faster, get the people involved that need to be involved. You've got to do that on a platform that really gives you the opportunity to move data quickly, to reduce the complexity of getting data from source system down to the end user or down to the people to make that insight. And then, so data, platform, and people really matter there. And also what I think that really is coming out of this and overcoming data friction is having the desire to really invent and experiment and understand the relationship between these kind of factors, but just the factors within your organization, right? How can you improve revenue? A lot of digital transformation really focuses on the digital experience, but I think all of that across financial services is really grounded in how are you going to grow new products and services within your organization, you leveraging your underlying data across all of those disparate source systems that are so critical for your business, and while at the same time managing into that complex and risk and regulatory environment. And I think those two things empowered by data are what digital transformation is really about, really moving into that. So it's certainly, I think, when you've got the platform to execute on that, you can really win.
I think, Steve, if we were to dive into that, we would need another full day of this.
Well, I think if it were you and I, we probably needed 2 full days. And maybe a retreat. Yeah, maybe a retreat is in order, Chuck, and I'll be the one buying when all of this pandemic stuff stops.
Hey, I never turn that down, Steve. Never turn that down.
Well, Chuck, I'm absolutely grateful for you for shedding some light and getting started on this dialogue and conversation about overcoming data friction. I think that there is work to be done in every organization with regard to data movement and building a more collaborative environment between data, technology, and business users and the IT teams that empower them. And let's hope that we can really grow revenue and profitability for all of our customers through the use of great technology and also with great process and platform positions. So I'm really grateful for your time today. Thank you so much. And my best to everybody at eCapital, and of course, thanks